Burroughs is a name synonymous with the Beat Generation, a literary movement that redefined American literature in the mid-20th century. Known for his unconventional style and exploration of taboo subjects, Burroughs left an indelible mark on culture with works like Naked Lunch. But beyond the pages of his groundbreaking novels lies a darker, more controversial chapter of his life. A chapter that blurs the line between art and tragedy. In 1951, Burroughs was living in Mexico City, far from the literary circles of New York and San Francisco. It was here, in the heart of a vibrant yet dangerous city, that an incident occurred which would forever alter the course of his life. A tragic event that not only took the life of his common-law wife, Joan Vollmer, but also sparked rumors, speculation, and a haunting conspiracy theory. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the events surrounding that fateful night in Mexico City. We'll explore the lives of William S. Burroughs and Joan Vollmer, unravel the mystery of the so-called William Tell incident, and examine the shocking theory that some believe could explain it all. So sit back as we journey through one of the most infamous and unsettling moments in literary history. Before we dive into today's case, if you're a fan of true crime and love exploring the most fascinating and mysterious stories, make sure to hit that button and subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you'll be the first to know when we drop new content, and it really helps us bring more in-depth investigations your way. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. Now let's get into today's story. William S. Burroughs was born in 1914 into a wealthy family in St. Louis, Missouri. His upbringing was marked by privilege, but also by a deep sense of alienation that would follow him throughout his life. He attended Harvard University, where he studied English, though his interests were far from academic. After college, Burroughs drifted through various jobs, never quite fitting in with the conventional life expected of him. In the early 1940s, Burroughs found himself in the orbit of a group of young writers and artists who would later become the core of the Beat Generation. Among them were Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, two figures who would play pivotal roles in his life and work. It was during this time that Burroughs began experimenting with drugs, a habit that would come to define much of his writing and personal life. Burroughs' writing was groundbreaking, marked by a raw, unfiltered exploration of the human condition. His work often delved into themes of addiction, control, and the darker aspects of human nature. These themes were not just literary explorations, they were reflections of his own struggles. Burroughs was a man at odds with himself, battling both his addiction to heroin and his conflicted feelings about his sexual identity. His personal life was as unconventional as his writing. Burroughs had relationships with both men and women, but his most significant relationship was with Joan Vollmer, a fellow member of the Beat Circle. Joan was intelligent, fiercely independent, and equally unconventional. Together, they formed a volatile partnership fueled by their mutual addiction and shared disdain for societal norms. By the late 1940s, Burroughs and Vollmer had moved to Mexico City, seeking an escape from the legal troubles and societal pressures they faced in the United States. Mexico offered them a kind of freedom they couldn't find elsewhere, a place where they could live on their own terms, however chaotic those terms might be. But this freedom came at a cost. Burroughs' addiction deepened, and his relationship with Vollmer became increasingly strained. Despite the turmoil, Joan remained a central figure in Burroughs' life, a muse who inspired some of his most profound work. Yet, as their lives spiraled out of control, the seeds of tragedy were being sown, leading to a night that would change everything. Joan Vollmer was more than just William S. Burroughs' common-law wife. She was a pivotal figure in the Beat Generation, a woman whose intellect and spirit resonated deeply with the writers and artists around her. Born in 1923, Joan was a bright and rebellious young woman. She attended Barnard College in New York City, where she quickly became known for her sharp mind and independent streak. It was here that she met people like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, forming bonds that would last throughout her short life. Joan's apartment in New York became a hub for the emerging Beat movement. It was a place where ideas flowed as freely as the alcohol and drugs that often accompanied them. Joan was not just a passive observer, she actively engaged in the discussions, challenging and inspiring the men around her. Her relationship with Burroughs began in this environment, where they bonded over their shared disdain for conventional society and their mutual struggles with addiction. Their relationship was complex and often tumultuous. Joan was fiercely independent yet deeply connected to Burroughs in ways that were both intellectual and emotional. Together they had a son, William S. Burroughs Jr., though their lives were far from those of a traditional family. The couple's relationship was marked by periods of intense connection and equally intense conflict, often exacerbated by their drug use. In 1949, they decided to leave the United States, seeking a new start in Mexico City. The move was partly to escape legal issues in the U.S., but also to find a place where they could live freely, away from the societal norms that neither of them had much interest in adhering to. Mexico City, with its vibrant culture and relative lack of legal scrutiny, seemed like the perfect place for them. In Mexico, Joan continued to play a central role in Burroughs' life and work. She was his confidant, his muse, and often his harshest critic. But the move did little to alleviate the underlying issues in their relationship. The chaos of their lives in New York followed them to Mexico, with their drug use escalating and their relationship growing more strained. Despite the turmoil, Joan remained an intellectual force, someone who could hold her own in the male-dominated world of the beats. She was a woman ahead of her time, unafraid to live on her own terms, even if those terms were fraught with danger and instability. As their lives in Mexico City became increasingly erratic, it was clear that something had to give. Little did they know, the pressure cooker of their existence was about to explode, leading to a tragedy that would haunt Burroughs for the rest of his life. The night of September 6, 1951, started like many others for William S. Burroughs and Joan Vollmer. They were in Mexico City, spending time with friends, drinking heavily as they often did. The atmosphere was typical of their life in Mexico, chaotic, unpredictable, and always teetering on the edge of something dangerous. But what happened next would forever change the course of Burroughs' life and cast a dark shadow over his legacy. As the night wore on, Burroughs, in a drunken haze, suggested playing a game of William Tell. The game, based on the legendary story of the Swiss folk hero, involved shooting an object off a person's head. In this case, the object was a glass, and the person was Joan Vollmer. Despite the obvious dangers, Joan agreed to the game. Perhaps she thought Burroughs wouldn't actually go through with it, or maybe she simply trusted that he wouldn't miss. But as Burroughs raised his pistol, the atmosphere in the room must have shifted from drunken revelry to something much more ominous. Burroughs took aim and pulled the trigger. But instead of hitting the glass, the bullet struck Joan in the head, killing her almost instantly. In that split second, everything changed. The room that had been filled with laughter and intoxicated chatter fell silent, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. Burroughs, shocked and devastated, was immediately arrested by Mexican authorities. They charged him with criminal imprudence, a lesser charge compared to murder, reflecting the belief that the shooting was an accident. He spent 13 days in a Mexico City jail before being released on bail, thanks to his family's influence and wealth. The legal case against Burroughs was complicated. On one hand, it was clear that he had killed Joan. On the other, there was little to suggest that it had been anything but a tragic accident. But Mexico's legal system was unpredictable, and Burroughs faced the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence if convicted. In the days that followed, Burroughs' life was thrown into turmoil. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, and the full weight of his actions pressed down on him. His friends and family rallied around him, but nothing could erase the fact that Joan was dead, and it was his hand that had pulled the trigger. The trial that followed was brief. Burroughs was convicted in absentia after he fled Mexico, unable to face the consequences of his actions. The court sentenced him to 2 years in prison, but he would never serve that time. Instead, he returned to the United States, a fugitive from Mexican justice, carrying with him the guilt and trauma of what he had done. The William Tell incident became a defining moment in Burroughs' life, a tragic mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his days. It was a moment that revealed the darkest corners of his personality and set the stage for a lifetime of introspection and literary exploration. From that night forward, Burroughs was no longer just a writer and a member of the Beat generation. He was a man with a shadow over his soul, grappling with the demons that had driven him to pull the trigger. Following the tragic shooting of Joan Vollmer, William S. Burroughs found himself entangled in a complex legal situation in Mexico. The authorities charged him with criminal imprudence, a charge that reflected the belief that Joan's death was not premeditated, but rather the result of reckless behavior. Burroughs was jailed for 13 days in Mexico City, a brief but harrowing experience that only deepened his sense of despair and guilt. However, Burroughs did not face this situation alone. His family, wealthy and well-connected, swiftly intervened to secure his release on bail. Their influence and resources played a crucial role in ensuring that Burroughs did not remain in a Mexican prison for long. The legal defense they mounted was strong, but the uncertainty of the Mexican legal system loomed large. As the trial approached, Burroughs made a decision that would change the course of his life. He fled Mexico. Unable to face the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence and haunted by the death of Joan, he left the country, abandoning the legal proceedings. This decision marked him as a fugitive, but it also allowed him to escape the immediate consequences of his actions. In his absence, the Mexican court proceeded with the trial and ultimately convicted Burroughs in absentia. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a sentence that he would never serve. The conviction became just another unresolved chapter in the tragic story of Joan Vollmer's death. Burroughs' escape from Mexico did not mean an escape from his guilt. The weight of what he had done followed him back to the United States, where he was forced to confront the reality of Joan's death in a different way. His writing, always dark and introspective, took on even deeper tones as he struggled to make sense of the tragedy. For Burroughs, the incident was a turning point, not just legally but personally. It pushed him further into the depths of addiction and depression, but it also fueled his literary career. The guilt and trauma he carried became central themes in his work, particularly in his exploration of control, violence, and the darker aspects of human nature. While Burroughs may have evaded the legal consequences of Joan's death, he could not escape the psychological ones. The William Tell incident became a defining moment in his life, a tragic mistake that cast a long shadow over his career and personal life. It was an event that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come, both by Burroughs himself and by those who studied his work and his life. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Burroughs continued to write, producing some of his most influential work. But the memory of Joan Vollmer and the night she died never left him. It haunted his dreams, shaped his prose, and became a permanent scar on his soul. In the wake of Joan Vollmer's tragic death, a disturbing conspiracy theory began to take shape. This theory suggested that the shooting was not merely a drunken accident, but rather a calculated act by William S. Burroughs to escape his marriage. At the heart of this theory was Burroughs' struggle with his sexual identity, a struggle that he had battled for much of his life. By the time of the incident, Burroughs was known to have had relationships with men, and he had openly expressed his conflicted feelings about his sexuality. Some have speculated that his relationship with Joan, though intellectually stimulating, was also a source of deep personal conflict. According to this theory, the infamous William Tell game was a convenient way for Burroughs to rid himself of a life he no longer wanted, a way to free himself from the heterosexual marriage that he felt trapped in. Proponents of this theory point to the circumstances of the shooting, the fact that Burroughs suggested the game in the first place, his history of erratic behavior, and the ease with which he fled Mexico afterward. To them, these are not the actions of a man who made a tragic mistake, but rather those of someone who had carefully orchestrated a way out. However, this theory remains highly controversial and is largely based on speculation rather than concrete evidence. While it's true that Burroughs struggled with his identity and was deeply unhappy at times, there is little to definitively suggest that he deliberately killed Joan. Those who knew him well have often dismissed the theory, pointing out that Burroughs was devastated by Joan's death, and that his actions afterward were more indicative of guilt and confusion than cold calculation. Moreover, Burroughs himself reflected on the incident throughout his life, describing it as a turning point that drove him deeper into his writing. He never denied his responsibility for Joan's death, but he always maintained that it was a terrible accident, one that haunted him for the rest of his days. The persistence of this conspiracy theory speaks to the complex and often contradictory nature of Burroughs' personality. He was a man who lived on the edge, constantly pushing the boundaries of social norms and personal behavior. For some, the idea that he could have orchestrated Joan's death fits with this image. For others, it's an unfounded attempt to make sense of a senseless tragedy. In the end, the truth of what happened that night in Mexico City may never be fully known. The William Tell incident remains one of the most controversial moments in literary history, and the conspiracy theory, while compelling to some, remains just that, a theory. What is certain, however, is that the event had a profound impact on Burroughs, shaping the themes of his work and the course of his life in ways that even he may not have fully understood. After fleeing Mexico in the tragic death of Joan Vollmer, William S. Burroughs found himself grappling with a profound sense of guilt and loss. This event became a defining moment in his life, one that would influence his work and his legacy for decades to come. The William Tell incident didn't just mark the end of his relationship with Joan, it marked the beginning of a new phase in his literary career, one deeply infused with the darkness that had come to dominate his life. Burroughs returned to the United States a changed man. He immersed himself in his writing, using it as a way to process the trauma and guilt he felt. His work became even more experimental and intense, delving into themes of control, violence, addiction, and the complex interplay between power and submission. These themes weren't just artistic explorations, they were Burroughs' way of confronting the demons that had driven him to that fateful night in Mexico City. In his seminal work, Naked Lunch, Burroughs pushed the boundaries of what literature could be, creating a fragmented, hallucinatory narrative that reflected the chaotic state of his own mind. The book was both a reflection of his inner turmoil and a rejection of conventional literary norms. It was controversial, banned in several cities, and even led to an obscenity trial. But it also solidified Burroughs' place as one of the most innovative and influential writers of his time. As Burroughs continued to write, the shadow of Joan Vollmer's death lingered over him. He spoke of the incident often, referring to it as a catalyst that propelled him deeper into his work. He believed that without Joan's death, he might never have become a serious writer. This idea, that tragedy can drive creativity, became a central theme in his life, though it was one he struggled with privately. Despite the controversy surrounding the William Tell incident, Burroughs' literary contributions cannot be denied. He inspired countless writers and artists, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in literature and paving the way for future generations of avant-garde creators. His influence extended beyond the written word, seeping into the worlds of music, art, and film. Yet, for all his success, Burroughs remained a deeply conflicted figure. The guilt he felt over Joan's death never truly left him, and it colored his work with a sense of doom and fatalism. He once wrote that he was cursed by the incident, that it had marked him in a way that nothing else could. This curse, however, also became his muse, driving him to create some of the most challenging and innovative literature of the 20th century. As we look back on William S. Burroughs' life and work, it's impossible to separate the man from the tragedy that shaped him. The William Tell incident remains one of the most infamous moments in literary history, a moment that transformed Burroughs from a struggling writer into a literary legend. But it also serves as a reminder of the personal cost of that transformation, a cost that Burroughs bore in silence for the rest of his life. William S. Burroughs' life is a testament to the complex interplay between creativity and tragedy. The William Tell incident, a moment of recklessness that ended in the death of Joan Vollmer, was a turning point that forever altered his path. It's a story that continues to fascinate, not just because of the gruesome details, but because of what it reveals about the man behind the words. In the aftermath of Joan's death, Burroughs found himself on a journey of introspection and artistic exploration. The themes that emerged in his work, control, addiction, violence, were more than just abstract concepts. They were the very struggles he faced in his own life, made tangible through his writing. Burroughs' ability to channel his pain and guilt into groundbreaking literature is part of what makes him such a compelling figure, even decades after his death. Yet the shadow of the William Tell incident never fully dissipated. It haunted Burroughs, coloring his life and legacy in shades of darkness. The tragedy became a permanent part of his narrative, influencing how he was perceived by both his contemporaries and future generations. For some, it was proof of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of genius. For others, it was a grim reminder of the fragility of human life, even in the hands of someone as brilliant as Burroughs. As we reflect on the life and work of William S. Burroughs, we are left with a portrait of a man who was as much a product of his demons as he was a master of his craft. The story of the William Tell incident and its aftermath is not just a tale of a single tragic mistake, but a window into the mind of a writer who spent his life wrestling with the darkness within. Burroughs once said that writing was a way to exorcise his demons, and in many ways, his work was his attempt to do just that. But the ghosts of his past, especially that night in Mexico City, were never fully laid to rest. They lingered in his words, in the spaces between his sentences, and in the silences that punctuated his life. In the end, the legacy of William S. Burroughs is one of both brilliance and tragedy. He pushed the boundaries of literature, creating works that continue to inspire and challenge readers. But his life also serves as a reminder of the cost of that brilliance, a cost paid in the currency of human relationships, personal peace, and ultimately, the life of Joan Vollmer. As we close this chapter, we're left with the understanding that William S. Burroughs was a man who lived on the edge, constantly navigating the fine line between creation and destruction. And in that space, he found both his greatest success and his deepest sorrow. The William Tell incident is a stark reminder of how thin that line can be, and how even the most brilliant minds are not immune to the tragic consequences of their actions. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the life and legacy of William S. Burroughs. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with others who might be interested. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more content exploring the fascinating and sometimes tragic stories behind history's most influential figures. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'll see you in the next video.